Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third in a series of videos concerning the COVID-19 impacts of the employment situation in the Hickory metro area. Today, we're going to look at the July 2020 data from the current employment statistics file. And what you're going to notice in terms of our recovery is that our employment numbers have actually kind of stagnated between June and July. We didn't have a whole lot of growth in many of the industries in the region. We do have a few that have had some growth, and we'll talk about that. But you'll be able to see in the numbers that we didn't really gain a whole lot of jobs between June and July of 2020. So let's go ahead and get started. And we'll look at the first slide. And you can see we've kind of been stretching this out over time. But you can see where we were before the pandemic started in March 2020. We had 150,200 jobs in the region. Our April 2020 numbers went down to 127,600. We had gained about 10,000 jobs between April and June of 2020. That's pretty good growth over just 2 months in terms of a recovery. However, if you look at the data between June and July, we only gained a net of 500 jobs. So that is certainly a much slower rate of recovery than what we had in the previous 2 months. We're still about 17,000 or so short of the employment numbers that we had before the pandemic. So we have gained about half of it back at this point, not quite half, but we still have a long way to go to get back to the numbers that we had last March. All right, if we look at goods producing, and then we'll look at service producing in a moment. If we look at goods producing, you'll see that we went from 38,700 in June to 40,100 in July. So that's pretty good growth. On the goods producing side, it's a gain of about 1,400 jobs. We are about 4,500 or so short of where we were before the pandemic started in March. And you can see we're kind of about 4,500 fewer goods producing jobs than in July of 2019. So we are still seeing some recovery in goods producing jobs, although the pace has not been quite as quick as what you saw between April and May. On the service producing side, we actually saw a job loss between June and July of 2020. You can see that in June, we had 98,800 service producing jobs in the Hickory MSA. We actually lost 900 service producing jobs between June and July. So that's certainly not the direction that we want to go in. Overall, we're still about 10,000 jobs or so short of the numbers that we had in March of 2020. So March 2020, we had 108,700. July of 2020, we had 97,900. And in a moment, we're going to talk about which of the individual goods producing and service producing sectors have been gaining employment versus losing employment over the past month. All right, so if we compare our data to a year ago, July 2019, this chart shows the industries that have lost the most. And as you can see, in terms of percentages, the biggest loss has been in furniture. They're now showing a 30% loss. So again, that's an improvement. If we looked at the numbers a couple months ago, the loss was more like 40 to 50% in furniture, but it's still 30% less than what we had a year ago. And that has a lot to do with why our numbers haven't come all the way back yet. We have a lot of jobs that are tied to the furniture industry in our area. And although we've seen some recovery, it's not back to where it was, as the US and the international economy continues to suffer under the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So to really get back to where we were pre-COVID, we're going to have to gain a lot more of our furniture jobs back. The second biggest loss was in textiles, 27.6%. So despite a lot of textile mills in our area being converted to produce PPE for the state and the country, we still have a pretty significant loss in textile mill jobs. So hopefully we'll see that turn around. That growth's kind of stagnated over the last month or so. You see a 22% loss in leisure and hospitality services. Of course, we are still in phase 2 of the governor's COVID-19 response. So we haven't seen a lot of change in rules as far as capacity of restaurants or additional service sectors, leisure and hospitality, that are allowed to open at this time. So I suspect for the next few months, we're going to continue to see that 20 to 25% loss compared to a year ago until we have more of a loosening of restrictions. Healthcare was for 15.3% loss. Again, when the pandemic started, we had a lot of outpatient surgeries that weren't allowed, things like dental cleanings, outpatient procedures, minor surgeries, things like that. There's still a lot of fear and concern about going to the doctor, going to the hospital for procedures. You're still seeing that with a lack of employment growth in that sector. So again, that's another one that's kind of stagnated. It had a good bounce back in April and May, but it's been kind of stagnant over the last couple of months. And then you see a new one on the list here, wholesale trade. That's definitely tied back to furniture. Since we are producing less furniture, there's less wholesale trade of that furniture. And that's actually led to a 13.6% loss of jobs in the wholesale trade sector versus a year ago. All right, let's look at job gains between June and July of 2020. You'll notice, first of all, compared to the previous videos that we've done, the percent increases month to month were a lot less than we've seen over previous months. The one exception to that is a category called other professional and business services. So basically what it is, those are services that are not temp jobs, that are more permanent jobs. So it can be things like consulting, engineering, architecture, finance, real estate. It's kind of a broad category that current employment statistics uses. But that sector has shown pretty good growth over the last month, a bounce back of 9.6%, which is really good news. A lot of jobs in this sector tend to be higher paying employment. So that's certainly a positive sign and a good direction that we want to see. Education had a 7% bounce back between June and July. So, and when you see education, that tends to be on the private sector side. So there's been some rehiring going on in the area, or perhaps revving up for the new semester coming up in the private education sector. And then you can see, once you get past that, the gains are more modest. The next three are basically types of manufacturing. So we have other non-durable goods. That's basically a non-durable good other than textiles. A product that lasts 1 or 2 years is what that means. So they've seen some recovery in the past month. So again, hopefully that's a positive sign. And then you see furniture and other durable products, which is basically non-furniture durable products. They've shown a 3% gain. So you can see furniture, it's gained some more back in the past month, but it's still 30% off of what it was in July. So if we see 2 or 3% growth a month, it's still going to take several more months to get back to where we were in terms of furniture employment. All right, we always try to show a comparison of our metro area versus others. And what you're looking at on this chart, this is the percentage job loss of North Carolina metro area employment comparing from July 2019 to July 2020. So in the Hickory MSA, you can see on the chart, it shows a 9.8% job loss. So basically, we have 10% less jobs in our area now than what we had the same time in 2019. How does that compare versus other areas? It's the third greatest percentage job loss. So it's not as much as Asheville, which of course is going to be highly tied into leisure and hospitality industries. And it's not quite as much as Goldsboro, but we did come in third place on that. And a lot of that has to do with losses on the goods producing and service producing side. So if you take the losses of leisure and hospitality with furniture and some of the other manufacturing, that's why we have a 10% loss. Interestingly, if you look at Jacksonville, they're almost back to where they were compared to a year ago. They're only down 0.4%. Of course, they have a strong military influence in the Jacksonville MSA. They're probably also being helped some by beach tourism season. That's helped their numbers a little bit. So that MSA isn't necessarily doing what the other metro areas are in the state in terms of job losses at the moment. All right, let's look at the change over the past month. And you can see here the Hickory MSA, we only showed a 0.4% growth. That doesn't sound like much, but if you look at the other metro areas in the state and actually North Carolina, a lot of the metro areas have actually shown a decline in numbers between June and July. So again, kind of a stagnation in the recovery for a lot of areas in the state, or actually a little bit of a backstep. You can see Asheville with a 2% loss, Goldsboro with a 2.4% loss, Greenville with a 2.2% loss, even Winston-Salem with a 1% loss. So compared to the others, being up 0.4 actually isn't too bad. The MSA that had the biggest percentage increase between June and July was actually the New Bern MSA. It went up 2.2%. And I think this has a lot to do, again, with beach tourism season, that with increased visitation to the North Carolina coast, that has led to some job growth, probably particularly in hospitality and tourism areas. All right, now we'll look at goods producing, and then in a moment we'll look at service producing trends for the statewide metro area. So again, looking at ours over the past 12 months in goods producing, again, goods producing is going to be manufacturing and construction mostly. You can see our percentage job loss is at 13.9%. Again, that's about double what the statewide loss is at 7.4%. We have the third biggest percentage job loss in goods producing. Durham Chapel Hill had the most, 18.4, and Rocky Mount was at 14.5. A lot of the job loss in goods producing in Durham Chapel Hill is actually not from manufacturing, but it's from construction, where they've had significant losses in construction. And that's why they ended up with the greatest percentage of job loss. Of course, in our case, it's mostly from manufacturing and not so much from construction. Interestingly, there's actually one MSA that's had an increase in goods producing between July 2019 and July 2020, and that's the Wilmington MSA. And for them, their increase is being caused by construction. So my guess is that you've got a lot of construction of homes along the coast and near the coast, and that's helped to boost their numbers up some. It'll be interesting to see how the impacts of Hurricane Isis affects the Wilmington area. Those numbers will probably be reflected in the August and maybe the September numbers. So it'll be interesting to see if Wilmington's able to maintain the job growth in that area after the hurricane came through. All right, looking at a month-to-month comparison, June 2020 to July 2020, again, you see the Wilmington MSA with an increase of 7%. The Hickory MSA actually had the second highest percentage increase of the North Carolina metro areas, 3.6%. So that's good news. And as you recall from the previous chart, it was actually a mix of different manufacturing types. So we had some growth in furniture, some growth in other durable goods. That'd be maybe even something like coaxial cable, fiber optics would be an example of that. And then actually other non-durable goods. So that might be something like food manufacturing, things like that. So being in second place is pretty good for that. And we're right up with the ones that had construction increases from new homes being built along the coast, like the Jacksonville MSA, for instance. If you look at the state number, they actually show a small loss in goods producing, and several of the MSAs actually show 1, 2, 3% losses in terms of goods producing employment. All right, now let's look at the service side. So again, this is the percentage job loss of service producing sectors between July 2019 and July 2020. So in the Hickory area, we have 8% fewer jobs in the service producing sector now versus a year ago. And it is a slightly bigger loss than the state. The two of the three MSAs with the largest loss are Asheville and Wilmington. Asheville had the biggest loss of 11.2%. Again, they're heavily influenced by leisure and hospitality, and the tourism industry has been slow to recover from the pandemic. So that's going to continue to weigh their numbers down some. And in Wilmington, it's kind of interesting because you saw an increase in construction for beach houses, but at the same time, you see a reduction in service producing employment from the leisure and hospitality section. So there's actually kind of two different things going on for them. All right, now we'll look at the monthly change. You can see that we actually had a 0.9% loss in terms of service producing employment between June of 2020 and July of 2020. We do show a loss. The loss isn't as much as some other metro areas. Asheville, Fayetteville, Goldsboro, High Point, Greenville had bigger losses, but there were some MSAs that had gains like Jacksonville and New Bern. So my suspicion on this is we might get a little bit of a bump up in August or September, maybe with school starting back, but really until we move out of phase 2, which is at least going to run through mid-September now, probably aren't going to see a lot more growth in service producing employment in our area until restrictions are eased a little bit more than they are today. All right, leisure and hospitality, again, we're looking at the change over the past year. The Hickory MSA, we have a 22.1% fewer jobs in July of 2020 compared to a year ago. That's pretty close to the state average at 24.8%. MSAs that were impacted the most, see Durham, still almost has a 40% loss in terms of leisure and hospitality employment compared to a year ago. And Asheville, of course, we've mentioned several times with about a third fewer jobs in leisure and hospitality. Rocky Mount's also been hit really hard with leisure and hospitality job losses, even though their tourism industry is obviously much smaller than what you would see in the Asheville or Wilmington areas. So looking at all the metros, our percentage loss is not as bad as other areas in the state. And looking at the monthly change, we did see a little bit of a bump up in leisure and hospitality. We went up 1%, so maybe a few of the restaurant jobs continued to come back between June and July, but our growth rate is slower than many of the MSAs in the state. So you kind of see with Fayetteville, Raleigh, Rocky Mount, Wilmington, and Winston-Salem, they had 4 to 7% growth or so in terms of leisure and hospitality employment recovery. The state went up 2%. We only went up about half of what the state rate is. So we are gaining some of those jobs back, but not nearly at the same rate as other areas in the state. Again, Asheville is kind of interesting. They actually were the only MSA to have a net loss in leisure and hospitality employment between June and July of 2020. So what I'm hoping is not going on is that some of the small businesses have been forced to close because of the pandemic. And it'll be interesting to see not only for our area, but other areas in the state, that as the pandemic continues, how will that affect small businesses? And will we see more small business closures that will in turn impact the employment numbers going forward? So we'll just have to wait and see what happens over the next few months on that. And that concludes the July 2020 look at the current employment statistics data for our area. Again, if you have any questions about the data that was presented in this video, definitely feel free to contact me. My email address is taylor.dellinger@wpcog.org. And you can also give me a call at the office at 828-485-4233. Thank you very much for listening. We're going to continue this series for the next few months, at least through December, just to kind of see how things are going in our area in terms of employment. And when eventually we get to phase 3 of the governor's COVID-19 recovery, how that will impact our numbers. And again, how our numbers will compare to other areas in the state. So thank you for joining us. And again, if you've got any questions, feel free to email me or give me a call. Thank you very much.